Welcome back. Now in my previous lecture we saw Ode to the West Wind, the first 3 cantos. Now this is a very long poem. This has been divided into 5 cantos or sections. In the first 3 cantos, we saw how the west wind has become an agent which ushers in the new season. We also saw a line by line explanation of the first 3 cantos. Now this is a very long poem of 70 lines. So we will now begin with the 4th canto, but before I begin with the 4th canto, I would again like to recapitulate what we saw in the first 3 cantos. The first canto shows the west wind as an element of nature where it is personified as a person blowing through the autumn season. He also in the first canto addresses the west wind as the autumn's breath. So here we find him giving life to the west wind as though the autumn season is breathing. And then he compares the west wind first to an enchanter which drives away the ghosts, and then to a charioteer which drives away the dead leaves. Now he also describes the various colors of the leaves, which are yellow, black and hectic red. Now these actual colors make it look as though they are deceased. Now here, as I explained in my previous lecture, these pestilence stricken multitudes, that is the different colored leaves, are actually reminiscent of the ill feelings or thoughts which the people have in society. So like the west wind blows away these dead deceased leaves, he wants the west wind also to blow away the evils in the society. He then compares the west wind to a charioteer, as I said, where the seeds are carried to their winter graves only to wait to bloom when the spring season comes in. And also we find that he talks of the west wind like it is driving the flocks across the valley. So we find the clouds moving over the sky as though flock of sheep, they are driven across the valley. And also we find that in the first canto he ends with a paradox. He says the west wind is both a destroyer and a preserver. He beautifully imagines how the west wind is a destroyer by driving away the dead leaves and thrusting the seeds into their winter graves, but actually the west wind is preserving these seeds to bloom in winter. In the next canto we find him talking about this west wind driving the clouds across the sky where they are now gathering for a thunderstorm, and he also calls the sky to be a vaulted dome where the entire clouds look as though it is a ceiling over the earth. And also he calls it to be the dirge of the dying year. West wind is a dirge which ends the end of the season, autumn season. Next he moves on in his second canto to show how the Mediterranean Sea is woken from its slumber by the might of the west wind. Even the marine life under the sea is trembling to hear the sound of the west wind. Now in this lecture we will begin with the 4th canto by doing a line by line. So here we find that the poet is trying to describe his own desires. Till now he was talking of the might of the west wind, but here we find him asking to be changed into something so that the west wind can help him. So what does he first say here? He wants to be a dead leaf which the west wind usually drives away. And also here he wants to become a swift cloud to fly with thee. That is, he wants to fly with the west wind. Now in the next line we see he again wishes to be something else, a wave to pant beneath thy power and share the impulse of thy strength, only less free than thou, O uncontrollable. So here now he wants to be a wave which is tossed by the west wind. And what is the next thing he says? He also wants to become the strength which the west wind has. So we find here he is aspiring certain things to possess, and he is again comparing himself with the west wind. So here he says he wants to have the power of the west wind himself, and he also wants to be uncontrollable like the west wind. Now the next line, if even I were as in my boyhood, and could be the comrade of thy wanderings over heaven, as then, when to outstrip thy skyey speed, scarce seemed a vision. Now here in the third line you see he calls the west wind to be his comrade, that is a friend. So here he is saying that he is a friend of the west wind, and also he says that he can't just be a leaf or a cloud. If he wants to be the comrade as he was in the youth. So here he says, in youth I have always imagined your strength, now I want to be your comrade again, and also I want to exceed the speed which you have. That is why he says skyey speed scarce seemed a vision. So in youth he had imagined that he should be as fast or even faster than the west wind. Now that is where he says, I want to be more powerful than thee. Now in the next line he says, I would never have striven as thus with thee in prayer in my sore need. So what does he mean here? He says he was to be faster and also more powerful than the west wind, and he actually makes that as a prayer. He is beseeching the west wind to give him the strength as well as the speed which he wants. So in these lines we find that he tries to compromise with the west wind. Give me the strength, he says, and also the speed. And also he gives a reference here to his youth where he says, I want to have the same relationship with you which I had in my youth. So let me be more faster as well as more powerful than thee, he says. Now why does he say this? Why is he beseeching the west wind? He is very much aware that he can never compete with the element of the nature, that is the west wind. That is why he is praying here to the west wind. He is requesting the west wind to make him his equal both in the strength as well as might. Now let us see the next line. Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. Now we saw in the previous line that he was asking the west wind to make him something different. He wanted to be a leaf to be driven by the west wind. Then he said, I want to be lifted as a cloud on the skies, and of course a wave. In the next line he said he wants to become a wave. Now in this line, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. What does it indicate? It shows that in his human life he was suffering much, and he was actually pricked by the pains, that is the thorns of life, and he is bleeding. So here is a picture, a pathetic scene where he says, I have been dealt many tragic blows by life and I am actually bleeding. So here he says, lift me to a higher state so that I rise above the normal human life. I am able to sustain the pain caused by life. And also the next line he says, a heavy weight of hours has chained and bowed one too like thee, tameless and swift and proud. He says a heavy weight of hours. What does that mean? The passage of time. He is indicating the passage of time here and saying, this time which has passed has also crushed my spirit. It is a weight on me now. I am crushed by the weight of time. And he is again praying, let me be tameless, no one should control me. And also I want to be swift as well as proud as you. So here in these lines we find that he is actually praying to the west wind to lift him to a higher state of order so that he can be free and enjoy the speed. Now the next line brings in a different image now. He says, make me thy lyre, even as the forest is. What if my leaves are falling like its own? Now here you find that he is comparing himself with the forest. Now he says that let me become a lyre. What is a lyre? It is a musical instrument. Now this lyre is a stringed instrument, and it also is mostly used as a metaphor in Roman poetry, that is, or rather I should say romantic poetry. So like other romantic poets, he is using an image of a lyre here and saying, I want to become a lyre. Now we can imagine, he says, even as the forest is. when the west wind moves through the forest, naturally there will be a whizzing sound. Likewise, he says, make me a lyre so that you blow through me and I can make a sweet music. And he is also saying that this lyre will be playing a music of its own if you lift me as a lyre. And then what if my leaves are falling like its own? Like we see in the beginning of the poem, he said that the autumn season brings in the west wind, which makes the old leaves fall from the trees and is driven away. Now here he says, likewise the leaves of my life are also falling down. And he asks the question, what if my leaves are falling? Here he is not bothered that he is facing much difficulty in life, that life has dealt him many blows. So here he is saying, even if my life is painful, even if I am suffering, I want you to play sweet music with me. So kindly change me into a lyre, he says. Now let us move to the next line. The tumult of thy mighty harmonies will take from both a deep autumnal tone, sweet though in sadness. Now here he says, the autumn season, as we know, is where there is a change in nature, nature starts to slumber before the winter and almost all leaves from trees fall down. So here he says, the tumult of thy mighty harmonies, you blow with great force during the autumn season. In that way, all the trees shed their leaves. So your autumnal tone begins, that is the west wind tone begins in the autumn season. So here he is saying, let there be sweetness even through sadness. So though the music created by the west wind through the falling leaves of the forest is sad, he says it is musical. It is very sweet to hear. Likewise, he says, though life has given me much trouble, the music you will create in me will also be sweet yet melancholic. Be thou, spirit fierce, my spirit. Be thou me, impetuous one. So again here we find him impeaching. He is asking, he is pleading with the west wind. He is saying, be my spirit. I want you to make me your spirit. So that, like he said in the previous lines, he wanted to be lifted like a wave, a cloud, as well as a leaf. And also in the previous line he was saying that he wants to be changed into a lyre. He says here, you become my spirit, make me everything which is there in nature. And we find here a shift in tone. The previous lines he was asking him to be changed into something which the west wind handles. But what does he say in this line? Be thou me. He wants to become the west wind himself, so that he can raise a spirit which is as fierce as that of the west wind. Now, if you remember what I said in the beginning of the lecture, I told you that Shelley was a radical. He had very different ideas and he was trying to always propagate his radical views. So now we find that in this ode, he is trying to make the west wind carry his message into the society. That is why here he is saying, let me become you. Like the west wind sweeps through the autumn season, let my views also sweep across the society. That is why he here wants to become the autumn season's west wind himself. He also wants to unite his spirit with the west wind so that he too, that is his views also become fierce, which will be heard by everyone. Now the next line, as I told you, he continues this thought now. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. So like the dead leaves of trees, let my thoughts, that is my thoughts, be driven across the world so that it will bring in a new birth. So we find here he is using a metaphor. He says, drive my thoughts like, or rather I should say it is a simile. He is saying like the withered, the dead and fallen leaves, drive my dead thoughts also. Why dead? Because it is only within himself. Only when it moves out to other people will it become alive. That is why he is saying, my dead thoughts, that is my hidden thoughts, let it be spread over the universe where it can spread and bring in a new birth. So here he is asking the west wind, drive me or drive my thoughts across the universe so that it brings in a new life. Now the next line, and by the incantation of this verse, what is incantation? Reciting, saying it in a melodious way. And by the incantation of this verse, scatter as from an unextinguished hearth ashes and sparks my words among mankind. Now there is another metaphor here. You can imagine what a hearth is. What is a hearth? It is where you place some logs and light a fire to warm the house. Now here he is saying unextinguished hearth. Now after the bright flames die down, we know that fire will still lurk among the ashes, and if we just blow over the ashes there, we can see the sparks flying. So here he is giving the image of the unextinguished hearth and saying that with the blow of wind, the ashes will fly and the sparks also will fly. Like that, he wants here these verses to be said often so that the dead thoughts which he has in his mind can be blown over with more bright light. So here he says, he is describing his own words. He is saying that he is like an unextinguished hearth because all the feelings and thoughts he has is still boiling in him. So he wants the west wind to blow over him so that these thoughts come out and spread like the sparks in the unextinguished hearth. Now the next line, be through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy. So what is he saying here? Unawakened earth. The earth is slumbering. It needs someone to wake it. Why should it be awoken? Here he is saying the world needs my thoughts to come alive. That is why he says, be through my lips, be the words from my lips, carry my thoughts and words to the wild world so that you sound like a trumpet of a prophecy. He has so many radical ideas in his mind. So here he is saying, I want to be a trumpet. I want to blow loud and clear so that all people can hear me. So here he is saying, what is a prophecy? We know for prophecy is where you foretell something which is going to happen later. So here he is wishing that the west wind would use him as a trumpet and also blow it across the world so that the sleeping mankind can awaken with his prophecy. Now this is the last line in the fourth canto. He again ends it here with an appeal. He says, O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? Now here if you see, this is actually a prophecy. These lines are very famous in poetry. And here you find that he leaves this with a line saying, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? We know that only autumn, winter comes in. What happens during winter? Everything would be nearly dead and frozen. But when you have this torturous winter, we can be assured that the next season would be the spring season, which ushers in all pleasures in life. Likewise he says here, O wind, I know next season is winter. But if there is a winter, we can also be sure there is a spring season. So what does he actually mean here? He is saying this is a symbolic reference actually. This is a symbolic meaning we have to understand that during the winter, of course, there is death and decay in nature. Everything is dead. Everything comes to a standstill. But this nature will be awoken. It will have a rebirth in the spring season. Likewise he says here, my thoughts are now dead. They are inside me. They have not come out yet. So like the frozen winter, my thoughts are frozen in me. But I am always sure that there will be an awakening in the society like the spring season. So here he is saying that he is very optimistic. He knows that his radical thoughts will bring in a revolution in the society, and here he wants the west wind to be the medium through which he can blow to the whole of mankind. So far we saw a line by line explanation of the entire poem. As I mentioned earlier, this is a 5-canto poem of 70 lines. Now let me now give you a quick summary of the poem. In the first canto we find Shelley addressing the west wind as a destroyer and preserver. This is a very unique thought. no one could use his imagination to give such power to the west wind. And also we find that he next calls the west wind to be an agent to transform the whole world. Now to give a brief introduction about Shelley again, Shelley was one of the greatest romantic poets. He has written this poem, Ode to the West Wind. Now what is an ode? An ode is a simple lyrical poem which is in the form of an address to a particular subject. It need not be a person. So here we find in this ode, he is making the west wind as an agent and addressing it as though it is a living person. Now romantic poets were famous for addressing nature by endowing it with qualities like humans have. So in the same tradition, he has in this poem written about nature as a living person. Now in the first canto, we find him talking about how the dead leaves of the winter season are driven away by the west wind in the autumn, how it also heralds a new birth both in nature as well as he imagines in the society also. So he calls in the first canto the west wind to be an enchanter which drives away the ghosts, that is the evil in the society, and also like the wind which buries the seeds in the ground waiting for them to bloom in winter, he again says that the west wind is blowing across the society to bring in a new birth. And then we find in the second canto, he begins where he talks about the might of the west wind which is driving the clouds across the skies, where the clouds look like the wild hair of Maenad women. Thus the west wind here is also pictured to be a dirge, a dying song of the whole season. And then in the third canto we find him talking about how the mighty Mediterranean Ocean is also affected by the power of the west wind. He pictures here even beautifully saying that even the marine life can hear the sound of the west wind and they do thrash about and injure themselves. In Canto IV, we find him asking the west wind to make him into objects so that it can bring out all the spirit which is hidden inside him. So first he wants to make the west wind carry him like a dead leaf so that he can blow over the world and bring in new change. And also next he asks him to make it a cloud so that he can fly high, and then he also mentions he wants to become a wave so that he too can have the uncontrolled power of the west wind. Then he also says, I want to become your comrade as I was in my youth, where I was living in close affinity with you. We also then see him moving on to say that now life has dealt him many blows and he is now bleeding. So here he says, I am unable to do anything to let the people know my hidden thoughts. So be with me, show me the way so that even though if I am affected by life, I can spread my message across the world. So here he says, the west wind which is tameless, swift and proud is the only messenger which can take him to the world. And then in the final canto, that is Canto V, we find him pleading here with the west wind to make him a lyre first, and then he also asks it to be making him into a hearth, which is the fire which is hidden in the hearth. So here if he is a lyre, he can sing a sweet melancholic song so that his words are heard by the world. And also he wants the west wind to become his own spirit so that he can blow and bring in new revolution in the society. Then he says he wants the west wind to blow him like the sparks from an unextinguished hearth. He later also says, make me a trumpet so that I can blow and herald new changes in the society. Now the last line of the ode is an often quoted famous line, O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? Now these lines are actually an inspiration for the whole of mankind. Times always change. Always good things are heralded after bad things. So these lines show the hope that everything which is bad will come to an end and there will be a burgeoning of good things in the society. So here we find him in the last two cantos making his appeal apparent what he wants the west wind to do for him. So he reveals his thoughts that he is here as a savior for mankind, and he wants his hidden thoughts to be carried across over the world. So now here we find the major theme of this poem, which is nature, which has the power to bring in a change and rejuvenate the whole world. He invokes the west wind, which is an agent of the autumn season. He calls it to be the breath of autumn season, and also in the first three cantos we find him frequently asking the west wind to hear him. Only in the fourth and the fifth canto we come to know that he is asking the west wind to hear his thoughts, be his messenger, and take them across the whole world. So far we have seen a detailed explanation of the poem, and I have also now given you a summary of the whole poem. But does poem just stop with giving the meaning which the poet wants to convey? As I said earlier, analysis of a poem is very necessary to understand the beauty of the poem. So here we will do a detailed analysis, because this poem is very rich, not just with Shelley's thoughts, but also with the various images and poetic devices he uses to bring across his meaning. Otherwise, this poem will just stay as lines for us. Only if we analyze the beauty between the lines will we be able to appreciate the whole intent of the poem. So now we will analyze first the speech, that is the figure of speech in the poem, and before that I will explain to you the layout of this poem. This ode, as I said, is very long. It is divided into 5 cantos and it has 70 lines. Now let us do an analysis of the poem. Spring season here, now west wind is a metaphor for dying of old things. What is the spring season metaphor for? Here it shows human consciousness which could be awakened by new thoughts. And we find him here that he uses various objects from nature, like you have the clouds moving, then you have the leaves, the seeds. Then if I know you can tell about the Mediterranean Sea, he is saying the marine life also under the Mediterranean Sea. All these are objects from nature he has drawn, and also through them he tries to convey the theme which he is intending to convey: change and rejuvenation in society. So his ideas about power, quality finds aesthetic expression in this poem. Okay, next we can see the literary devices. There are many metaphors in this poem. Now the very first line begins with a metaphor. O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being. He does not say you are like the breath of the autumn. Here he says thou breath of autumn's being. So here we find that he is using his thoughts like that of the west wind, which can blow and spread. So here west wind, he makes it synonymous with autumn season itself. He does not say you are blowing during the west autumn season. He says you are the autumn's life breath itself. So here you have actually one or more metaphors compressed. Now here he is talking of the west wind as a human being even. Why then should he address the west wind? Here only a human can listen and understand. Here he is talking to the west wind. So here we have the metaphor of the west wind as a human being. Then of course here he actually talks of the autumn season even as a human being. That is why he says autumn's being. And then of course he says it is the breath of autumn season. So actually we have 3 metaphors compressed in the very first line. Now the next metaphor I can say is in line 5, where he says yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence stricken multitudes. See the words which have been lined one after the other. Now again the metaphor here is where he is actually saying the different multicolored leaves, they are pestilence ridden. What is pestilence? As I said earlier, it means an illness, disease. So here he says the multicolored leaves are pestilence ridden. That is how human thoughts also which are dead nearly forever with disease. Then in line 6 you have the next metaphor. He says, O thou who chariotest to their dark wintry bed. So here he is saying You are not like a chariot. He says you are the chariot itself which drives the seeds to their dark wintry bed. So, here the west wind is compared to a charioteer, and in the next line itself he says the winged seeds. Now, can seeds have wings? Can they fly? But here he says the seeds are driven by the west wind. So, it looks as though they have wings and they are flying. So, you have the next metaphor in the winged seeds. Now, let us see the next metaphor. You have to go to line 29 to 30 for that. He says, thou who didst waken from his summer dreams, the blue Mediterranean where he lay lulled by the coils of his crystalline streams. Now, here you find that the Mediterranean is sleeping from the coils of the crystalline streams, he says. So, here he is picturing the west wind to be a huge force which actually is rousing someone from sleep. So, the Mediterranean is sleeping, the west wind here is a person who is rousing the sea. Then in line 23 you have the locks of the approaching storm. Now, as we saw the description earlier, he was saying that the clouds are rising, they are coalescing, they are joining together to bring in the approaching storm. Now, the locks of the approaching storm we can say is an extended metaphor, directly not a metaphor but can be taken as a metaphor, where he compares the effect of the winds on the clouds which looks like hair, the clouds of hair. And here again the spring season indicates the consciousness, the human consciousness. So, here he is using the locks of the approaching storm to be the heralding of a change in the human consciousness with morality of course and liberty. Then in line 54 we have, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. Now, in this line again there is a metaphor where he is talking about himself as though he had been pricked by thorns and he is bleeding. Now, this is a metaphor for life. He is not actually bleeding, he is saying the pain is oozing out of me. So, here you have all the grueling experiences he has in life and what he wants to do to overcome the grief he has experienced. Now, that is why he is writing here, I want to come out of my leaf because I have fallen on the thorns of life. So, through all these metaphors we can see that he is symbolizing the power of nature as well as his own inspiration which he has imagined he got from nature. Now, next let us move to the next poetic device, which is similes. Again we find many similes in this poem. In line 3 you have description as, are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. So, the word like is here, we already know metaphor, there is a hidden reference, in a simile there is an open comparison. So, the words like ghosts from an enchanter show he is comparing the west wind to be like a magician or an enchanter who is driving away the evil spirits. And then in the next line, line 7 he says, the winged seeds where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave. So, again here you have another simile. So, these seeds are compared to a corpse which is lying in the grave, and so again in this line you have an open simile. Then in line 16, loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves are shed. So, the clouds which are moving across the skies to gather and bring in a storm, they are pictured like the earth's decaying leaves which are shed from the trees. Then in line 10 you have, her clarion over the dreaming earth and fill driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in air. So, the clouds which are moving, they look like the flocks which are driven by the spring wind. Then let me now deal with another poetic device. In this poem we can find many instances of alliteration. So, we will find out the places where alliteration is. Now, what is alliteration? Where you have a repeated sound in subsequent words. So, let us take the consonant sounds. As we can see, the sound were, I will not mention it as a letter or the alphabet W, I will name it as the sound were. Now, in the first line itself you have, O wild west wind. So, the sound were is there in wild, west and wind. Now, let us see in line 41, the sound g. In that line it runs, thy voice and suddenly grow grey with fear. So, there is another alliteration here where you say grow and grey. Okay, let me move on to another poetic device here, symbolism. This whole poem is a very symbolic poetry. He is addressing the west wind, asking it to be a messenger, but what is he actually meaning by that poem? So, here in line 4 you have yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence stricken multitude. So, here he is actually symbolizing the dead feelings or the thoughts in society. So, the whole society is diseased, or the dead or the outdated habits are diseasing the people. So, here he is saying let them be corrected so that they will not be corrupted again. So, symbolism is where we take an object, we give a different meaning to it. So, here the west wind is symbolized frequently throughout the poem. You see how it is symbolized with the mighty power of nature, where it is driving the dead leaves as well as making the clouds come together to pour the rain, and also the dying year is a symbol of the dying manhood. That is, though in the poem the west wind actually is a symbol of the dying of the year, here the symbol is to the dead mankind. Now, let me next take instances of imagery in the poem. Now, what is imagery? You take an object and you describe it in such a way that the reader can actually see it in his own mind's eye. Now, the first image I can see in this poem is a dark wintry bed. So, you have these adjectives here, dark and wintry, for the bed which is the land. So, this is an image you can see. Then the colors of the leaves which he says, yellow and black and pale and hectic red. So, we can see the various colors in our own mind's eye. And then of course, he says angels of rain and lightning, like angels have wings. These clouds are flying and they are actually bringing the rain and lightning. Now, these I can call to be visual imageries. Now, let me move now here to some examples of auditory images. Now, in the line the trumpet of a prophecy. Now, the very word trumpet, when I pronounce it, it gives the sound actually of a trumpet. So, I can call this to be an onomatopoeia also. Now, here the sound, the trumpet of a prophecy is a auditory image. Then I can name black rain and fire and hail will burst. So, these words are actually invoking in my mind the image of the huge storm which will bring down rain like fire. So, again this is another auditory image. And next the word her clarion, that is he calls the spring season to be a clarion. So, clarion again is a loud instrument. So, the very word itself brings that image also into my mind. Okay, and then let me see some moving images. How can an image move? By reading those lines itself, we can imagine the speed and movement of it. Now, one example is spirit, which are moving everywhere. So, we can imagine when we read these lines that the west wind is like a spirit which is freely blowing everywhere. And then in the next instance, scatter as from an unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks. So, while we read this itself, we can see the movement of the ashes from whence the sparks fly. So, scattering is a movement, and then the sparks flying from the unextinguished hearth is another kinetic imagery. Now, let me next deal with personification. Now, in this poem you have various again personifications. Of course, we can say that west wind itself is a personification here. West wind is an inanimate thing, it is only an element of nature, but here he is giving it life, he is personifying it as a person and talking to it throughout the poem. Now, here let me take other instances also. Destroyer and preserver he calls it. So, he is giving it a quality of both destroying and preserving it. Next he says, who chariotist. So, here it becomes a chariot, he is addressing it or personifying west wind as a chariot. Then he says, thou who didst waken from his summer dreams. So, the Mediterranean Sea seems to be like a person which is waking up from its summer dreams. The blue Mediterranean where he lay. Now the pronoun he here is used, the masculine pronoun is used to show that Shelley is actually personifying the Mediterranean Sea to be a male person. And then the next line says, thou breath of autumn's being. So again here we have a personification. He calls the west wind to be autumn's breath itself. Now here only a human being can breathe, but here he is personifying and saying west wind itself is like the breath of the autumn. Okay, let me next take another poetic device, which is anastrophe. What is an anastrophe? An anastrophe is where the word order is deliberately changed. For example, I can say an adjective should be followed by a noun, a verb should be followed by an adverb. But in this poem we find one or two instances where there is an anastrophe, that is the word order is changed. Now here in the sentence, dead leaves, we can say leaves are dead, but here he used leaves dead. So here we find an anastrophe where he changes the order of the word. Next, let me take the poetic device as enjambment. What is enjambment? Now it is defined as a poetic device where a poet does not use any punctuation mark at the end of the line, but rather continues the line as well as the thought into the next line. So here in this poem we have one example of an enjambment, I can say, that is in line 38, where it reads, cleave themselves into chasms while far below the sea blooms and the oozy woods which wear the sapless foliage of the ocean know. So you see that the entire thought runs into many lines. He actually uses no punctuations also at the other end because the thought is flowing still. So this is one example of enjambment we find. So far we have discussed all the poetic devices Shelley has used in this poem. Now let me deal with the various themes we can see in this poem. And the first theme is of course naturally power. Now he is here visualizing the west wind to be a mighty power. So the first theme we can see in this poem is the ability or the power, and also he is talking about human limitations. Humans have, like in the natural world, certain things which come to an end. So the major theme of this poem is power both in natural world as well as in human life. So here he is talking of the west wind to bring in new revolutionary ideas. Now this also, as I mentioned earlier, shows that Shelley wants his radical ideas to be spread across the world. So the main theme here we can say is power, and also the theme of nature. Throughout the poem he uses so many images which invokes in our mind the power of nature. Let me now conclude here by saying that this very long poem of Shelley is rather profound with its meaning as well as the poetic devices. It is a beautiful example of Shelley's love for nature as well as how this natural world actually influences his own personal thoughts. So here we find personification where he calls the west wind not just as an element but also as a messenger. So here we find how he has an affinity with nature, how he makes the natural world a source of his inspiration. He uses here both poetry as well as nature to spread his word across the world. Thus in this poem, he makes the west wind his messenger, and through apt poetic devices, he achieves grandeur in his poetry. Thank you.